Thank you, Benson. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm a very irregular player since I pulled my hamstring on Friday, so I think that's another sport I'm going to give up, which is probably not a good admission for a congress like this, is it? I'm also somebody wearing a tie as well, and I'm also from a country that's about to leave the European Union. I really feel in the wrong place at the moment. Okay, so if we could get my, beg your pardon, my presentation started. Beg your pardon. Here we go. So, this is my university. It's a picture of my university. Those of you who haven't been there, it's in the north of England, near Liverpool. And I'm going to talk about I'm going to try and talk about the bigger picture of sports diplomacy and where grassroots sport can fit in. I want to start by looking at some of the bigger picture in terms of developments at European level, and kick off by paying tribute to some very hard-working and I think very talented people in the European Commission, particularly the sport unit of the European Commission, who have been very instrumental in piecing together a sports policy of the European Union, and later on I'm going to explain where sports diplomacy fits into this. You can see that the beginnings of European sport policy really can be traced to the white paper on sport in 2007. There were plenty of initiatives before then, but this is really when we started to see the formalization of a European sports policy. And that white paper was introduced to, with a view to the Lisbon Treaty coming into force, and in particular the Lisbon Treaty's provisions on sport, Article 165. Article 165 is a very important development in terms of European sport policy, because for the first time it gives the European Union a competence in sports policy. Before then, the EU had no competence. And there were some concerns that European law was affecting the economic aspects of sport, particularly professional sport, in a way that was not giving due regard to the specificities of sport, and it wasn't really giving any consideration to the societal role of sport as well. So Article 165, I think, was a very important turning point in the history of European sports policy. Following on from that, we saw the Communication on Sport in 2011, which is another major policy announcement by the European Commission, really looking at sport through the lens of the organisation of sport, the economic dimension of sport, and the societal function of sport. And I think in terms of matching or the ability to achieve the EU's objectives in sport, the Erasmus Plus sport programme, I think, was very important, because it really gave an impetus towards sports policy in the sense that the European Union was now able to fund sporting activities. Prior to 2009, the European Union was not able to fund sporting activities, and had it done so, it was legally questionable because there was no reference in the treaty to sport and sport policy. So the EU had to be very careful when engaging in sport. But because of the Article 165 of the treaty, that's not a problem anymore. And then we have a number of successive work plans for sport operating within the European Union. The most recent work plan is between 2017 and 2020. And these really identify the priorities of European sport policy, of which sport diplomacy is currently one. So, where does sport diplomacy fit into that kind of trajectory? Because I think there's been a very significant trajectory in terms of European sport policy, from almost nothing to something quite significant. And sport diplomacy fits into that. Even though it's a new kid on the block, so to speak, I think it really has a bit of political momentum at the moment. In that white paper on sport, in section 2.7, which dealt with sharing our values with other parts of the world, I'm craning my neck here, so forgive me, it said, sport can play a role regarding different aspects of the EU's external relations. as an element of external assistance programmes, as an element of dialogue with partner countries, and as part of the EU's public diplomacy. So the genesis of EU sports diplomacy can really be traced back to 2007, so not that long ago. The breakthrough was with Article 165, as I've mentioned. And Article 165, even though it talks about the specific nature of sport and other things, tucked away in the third paragraph of that provision, there's mention of the Union shall foster cooperation with third countries and competent international organisations in the field of sport. For me, that indicates that there is a clear legal basis in the European Union to take further these sport diplomacy initiatives. The communication on sport in 2011 refers to identifying the scope for international cooperation in the field of sport, with a focus on the European third countries, in particular candidate countries and potential candidates, and the Council of Europe. Then we had a very significant development in 2015, because it's all well and good having the legal basis, the legal framework, to be able to start to develop these sports policies and sport diplomacy initiatives, but what you really need is political leadership. And the political leadership was provided by the commissioner who spoke to you yesterday, Tibor Navratic, who's responsible for education and culture. And Commissioner Navratic established two high-level groups, one on grassroots sport, the other on sport diplomacy. I was a member of the sport diplomacy team, and I think the reports are here, they're online as well, and you're free to consult them. I think they're significant because of the political impetus that the Commissioner gave to this agenda of promoting sport diplomacy at a European level. I'll come back to some of the themes contained in those reports a little later. Following on from the high-level group, I was very pleased to see, under the auspices of the Slovak presidency of the European Union, a set of presidency conclusions, or council conclusions, I should say, released on sports diplomacy. I have a copy of them here. They're far too long to go through, but one of them mentioned the need for sport diplomacy to remain on the European Union political agenda. The reason why I was very pleased to see this is because, of course, the high-level group that I worked on, we worked mostly in Brussels for about 11 months, not full-time, but that's where the meetings tended to be. And I didn't want personally to be part of an EU high-level group, but we gave our opinion and we wrote a report and it was put on the shelf. And it clearly hasn't been put on the shelf. It's being acted upon, which I think is very good news. And the Slovak presidency was the first that really started to push forward this agenda. In terms of keeping the issue of sports diplomacy on the political agenda, the Commission has organised a couple of seminars in Brussels on EU sports diplomacy. I was at both of those, and I think one or two people in the room were there as well. And the Commission also released a study in 2018 on sport diplomacy, identifying good practice. And I think the agendas and maybe some of the papers of the seminars are online. Certainly the paper on identifying good practice is online, and you can access that from the European Commission's website, which I can show you later if you'd like to know how to get there. And then finally, we have the European Union Work Plan for Sport. The most recent work plan for sport is the one that's currently in force between 2017 and 2020. This identifies the priorities of European sports policy up to 2020. And you can see how this is structured. The three broad priority areas relate to the integrity of sport, the economic dimension of sport and society. And you'll see tucked away at the bottom right-hand side, or bottom left-hand side, I should say, sport diplomacy is now a priority of the European Union through the work plan. Again, I think a significant development. I said finally, it's not quite finally. There are two sport diplomacy projects ongoing, the one that you've just heard about, and one that I'm leading at the moment, and Sylvia is also a member of the team that I'm leading. We're looking at promoting a more strategic approach to European Union sport diplomacy, and I think it's excellent that there are two funded sport diplomacy projects currently running. There has been a recent call. I don't know if any more sport diplomacy initiatives have been funded, but once again, I think it's good news. I think we should absolutely talk to one another, as we are doing today. We're both in the same room, which is what we should be doing. Our project has got quite a way to run yet. We've already had two meetings, one in Zagreb, one in Madrid. Our next meeting is in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe, if you'd like to come. We then have a meeting on mega events in The Hague. We then have another meeting in Skopje on grassroots sport diplomacy, and then we have our final flagship event in Brussels, maybe in September of next year. So you're all very welcome to attend these events. Going back to the big picture, my final slide. This is the boring kind of, it looks boring and academic and theoretical. Well, that's because it is, but hopefully I'm not going to make it too boring. I was asked to look at where does it all fit into the bigger picture. And you can see on the left-hand side the phrase market power. How do states and organisations such as the European Union, how do they achieve their diplomatic objectives? The traditional way, of course, was through their market power, their strength, the attraction of the single market, the single European market. Other states do it differently. They could achieve their diplomatic objectives through military force, for instance. My question is, and you're all familiar with Nelson Mandela's quote about sport having the ability, the power to change the world. My question is, does sport have the ability to change the character of the European Union? And I think there are two examples of where we can identify sport playing a small but significant role in changing the character of the European Union. The first is the move from a market-based mentality to a citizens' Europe. For many years, European sports policy has stressed the social dimension of sport, the importance of sport as a human activity, sport bringing people together, the role of sport for social inclusion. Many people dismiss these as hollow, empty words. Well, this year, the European Court of Justice handed down a major decision in a case called Topfit. This was a case involving an Italian national who was living in Germany and wanted to participate in amateur athletics. Amateur athletics, not professional. The law relating to nationality discrimination in professional sport is really quite clear in Europe, following the Bosman judgment. But in amateur sport, it wasn't. And for the first time, the European Court looked at the trajectory of European sports policy, looked at the role of sport for social inclusion, and said, unjustified nationality discrimination is unlawful, even when it is not connected to economic activity. We can debate the merits of this in terms of the organisation of sport in Europe, but I think it's a good thing. Access to sport at all levels, I think, as we heard this morning, should be considered a human right. That then raises the second question relating to normative power. Can sport help change the European Union's external dimension, its perception with non-European countries? And I think this is where sports diplomacy fits into the bigger picture, and in particular, where grassroots sports fits into the bigger picture. Because the European Union can project its power through its market, yes, but equally it can achieve its objectives through softer measures, such as projecting norms and its values. The question for the European Union is, how does it want to do that? Does it want to go down the road of traditional sports diplomacy, which is a political theatre with a sporting backdrop? Or does it want to engage at a grassroots level, at a people-to-people level? And obviously, I'm here today to say that I think that should be the latter. So, thank you very much for your attention.